The general principle is announced by Paul in the epistle to the Colossians, although he applies it specifically to a certain class of cases. Quote, "Wherefore," says he, "if ye be dead with Christ from the rudiments of the world, why, as though living in the world, are ye subject to ordinances, touch not, taste not, handle not, which are all to perish with the using, after the commandments and doctrines of men? Which things have indeed a show of wisdom in will worship and humility and neglecting of the body, not in any honor, to the satisfying of the flesh." Unquote. Instrumental music, as has been proved, was one of the rudiments of that ceremonial and typical ritual by which it pleased God to train the Israelites as children in a preparatory school for the manhood of the Christian dispensation with its glorious privileges and its expanded responsibilities. This was the view of even Aquinas and Bellarmine. He, therefore, who would import that effete element into the church of the new dispensation would impugn the wisdom of God, assert his will against the divine authority, and abandon the freedom of Christ for the bondage of Moses. Lecture number 4. Argument from the Presbyterian Standards. In arguing against the use of instrumental music in public worship from the Presbyterian Standards, that is, the formularies of doctrine, government, and worship of the Presbyterian Church, I desire it to be distinctly understood that they are not treated or viewed as an authority independent of the inspired Word of God. All the authority which they possess, every whit of it, is derived from the Word. Apart from it, they have none. In the first place, as human compositions, they may or may not exactly accord with the Scriptures and faithfully represent their meaning. So far as they do, and only so far as they do, they are clothed with the authority of the divine Word itself, and as every Christian admits that the authority of the Word is binding upon all men, they, to that extent, confessedly exercise a controlling authority upon all men. In the second place, the members, and especially the officers of that church of which they are a directory of faith and practice, are, over and beyond this general obligation which rests upon all men, under a special obligation resulting from their voluntary acceptance of these standards as a true interpretation of the Scriptures, and from their covenanted agreement with their brethren of the same faith and order to be governed by them as the constitution of their church. It is, therefore, with reference to them, not exclusively, but in a very special sense, that in the construction and development of this particular argument, the appeal is made to the Presbyterian Standards. I speak as unto wise men. Let them judge what may be said in relation to this venerable tribunal. Let it be also noticed that, in pursuing this particular line of argument, it is by no means claimed that new material proofs are derived from these formularies. The proofs have already been presented from the Scriptures both of the Old and New Testaments. The conclusion which they justify has already been reached and announced. The present appeal is to the Standards as clearly summing up the scriptural proofs and definitely enforcing the conclusion, and as having a peculiar authority for those who, in the conflict of religious opinions, have adopted them as, in their judgment, a correct statement and exposition of the law of the Lord. But in addition to this, let it be remarked that these standards clearly define the limitations upon such discretionary power in the sphere of worship, and in every other sphere, as is to be conceded to the Church. They define it both negatively, declaring what it is not, and positively declaring what it is. And it is in this especial regard that the reference to their authority is invested with interest and importance. Number 1. Instrumental music is, by good and necessary consequence, excluded from the public worship of the Church by the exposition which the catechisms furnish of the Second Commandment. In the citation of their words, only such will be adduced as bear upon the subject of worship, and are relevant to the question in hand. Quote, "What," asks the larger catechism, questions 108, 109, and 110, "are the duties required in the Second Commandment?" Answer, quote, "The duties required in the Second Commandment are the receiving, observing, and keeping pure and entire all such religious worship and ordinances as God hath instituted in His Word. Also, the disapproving, detesting, opposing all false worship, and according to each one's place and calling, removing it." Unquote. Quote, "What are the sins forbidden in the Second Commandment?" Unquote. Answer, quote, "The sins forbidden in the Second Commandment are all devising, counseling, commanding, using, and anywise approving any religious worship not instituted by God himself. All superstitious devices, corrupting the worship of God, adding to it or taking from it, whether invented or taken up of ourselves, or received by tradition from others, though under the title of antiquity, custom, devotion, good intent, or any other pretense whatsoever, all neglect, contempt, hindering, and opposing the worship and ordinances which God hath appointed. Quote, what are the reasons annexed to the second commandment, the more to enforce it? Unquote. Answer, quote, the reasons annexed to the second commandment, the more to enforce it, contained in these words, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me, and keep my commandments, are, besides God's sovereignty over us and propriety in us, his fervent zeal for his own worship, and his revengeful indignation against all false worship, as being a spiritual whoredom, accounting the breakers of this commandment such as hate him, and threatening to punish them unto diverse generations, and esteeming the observers of it such as love him, and keep his commandments, and promising mercy to them unto many generations. Unquote. The Shorter Catechism in questions 50, 51, and 52 thus condenses these statements of the larger. Quote, the second commandment requireth the receiving, observing, and keeping pure and entire all such religious worship and ordinances as God hath appointed in his word. Unquote. It, quote, forbiddeth the worshipping of God by images or any other way not appointed in his word. Unquote. Quote, the reasons annexed are God's sovereignty over us, his propriety in us, and the zeal he hath to his own worship. Unquote. Let us attentively consider the features of this commandment, which are signalized by these formularies. Number 1, the zeal and jealousy, fervent and lasting, which God manifests touching everything that concerns his worship. This is suited to arrest our notice, and to alarm and restrain those who assert their right to decree rites and ceremonies, and to regulate divine worship according to their own judgment and taste as to what is fitting and decorous in the services of the Lord's house. He himself stands guard over his own sanctuary, and armed with bolts of vengeance, threatens with condign punishment the invaders of his prerogative, the usurpers of his rights. We have seen how awfully this lesson was enforced under the old dispensation, how swiftly, like lightning, his judgments flashed against the rash and insolent asserters of their own will in regard to the mode in which he was to be worshipped, and how severely he dealt with his own choicest and holiest servants for departures from his prescriptions in this matter. This vehement zeal and jealousy of God for the purity of his worship should deter us from venturing one step beyond the directions of his word. Who, for the sake of the ornaments of art and the suggestions of fancy, would unnecessarily challenge the visitations of his wrath? In this dispensation he is patient and forbearing. But who will coolly elect to go, with the unexpunged guilt of encroaching upon the sovereignty of God over the worship of his house, to the tremendous bar of last accounts? Number 2. The great principle is here brought out and emphasized, that not only is what God has positively commanded to be obeyed, but what he has not commanded is forbidden. The law is not that we are at liberty to act when God has not spoken, but just the contrary. We have no right to act when he is silent. It will not answer to say in justification of some element of worship that God has not expressly prohibited it. We must produce a divine warrant for it. The absence of such a warrant is an interdiction. The exposition of the second commandment enforces the obligation not only to receive, observe, and keep pure and entire all such religious worship and ordinances as God hath instituted in his word, but also not to devise, counsel, command, use, and anywise approve any religious worship not instituted by God himself. The instance already commented on of Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, God's venerable high priest, is exactly in point. They were visited with summary judgment, as we are explicitly told, for performing a function in worship which God had not commanded. We cannot without guilt transcend divine appointments. No discretion is allowed the church to introduce into public worship what God himself has not instituted and appointed. He has not constituted her his vicegerent or his confidential agent. She is entrusted with no powers plenipotentiary. She acts under instructions and is required to adhere to the text of her commission. The application to instrumental music in the public worship of the church is plain. It was permissible, as has been shown, only when God commanded it, and he commanded it in connection with the typical and temporary services of the temple. He did not command it to be used in the ordinary Sabbath worship of the synagogue, and accordingly it was not employed in that institute. The Jew obeyed the divine will in that respect. God did not command it to be introduced into the Christian church, and in conformity with his will, it was not employed in the apostolic or the early church. It was not known in the church for centuries. It was, as will be shown, a late importation into its services, an importation effected without divine authorization, and therefore in the face of the divine will. If our exposition of the second commandment is valid, and we acknowledge it to be both valid and authoritative, we violate that commandment when we employ instrumental music in public worship, because we devise, counsel, command, use, and approve a mode of religious worship not instituted by God himself. That God did not institute it, either in connection with the Jewish synagogue or with the Christian church, has been irrefragably proved. These things being so, we cannot, in accordance with the requirements of this commandment, acquiesce in the employment of instrumental music in the public worship of the church. No, quote, title of antiquity, custom, devotion, good intent, or any other pretense whatsoever, unquote, will justify or excuse us. It will not avail us to plead that we found it in use, and are not called upon to urge or enact revolutionary measures. We are bound to disapprove, detest, oppose all false worship, and as this is in that category, to disapprove, detest, and oppose it, the argument to prove its want of divine warrant must be overthrown before the position of inaction and acquiescence can be conscientiously maintained. Nor will it do to say that we have not examined the question, that we do not know. We ought to examine, we ought to know, for as Presbyterians our standards plainly expound to us the divine law on the subject, and as Christians, we have no right to be ignorant of the teaching of Scripture in regard to it. Quote, to the law and to the testimony, if they speak not according to them, it is because there is no light in them. Unquote.